Welcome to the ATP podcast, and you're with our hosts, Elisma and Steve.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Steve.
Hello, we've got a great topic today, haven't we?
We do.
Oh, we're going to talk about, bum grubs?
Parasites, bum grubs, whatever you want to call them.
I love some of the things you were saying before about them. And this is no joke. Elisma said we're going to talk about things that suck blood and have orgies in your bowel.
Well, I wouldn't say that I use those exact words, but that's kind of like the insinuation.
Well, it's a little bit of an alteration, but not too much of an alteration. So what are we talking about today? What are some of the names of these guys that we're talking about? Bum grubs, parasites, what else are they known as?
Yeah, so parasites, it's kind of like a name that describes a group of organisms, if you wish. And so the types of parasites, everything that's kind of like classified under parasites is your amoebas, which is also sometimes referred to as protozoan organisms. You have flagellates, ciliates, apicomplexus, microsporidias, and helminths. And apparently it's their motility that kind of, it's the way they move that kind of like puts them into these different categories. But essentially, all of those are parasites.
All right. Well, let's bore people with some stats. About a third of the kids in the population of the world have worms, and about a quarter of us adults have these worms. About 2 billion people have bum grubs, have these parasites. So it's not like, it's a rare thing and it's only in third world countries. No, if you ever eat a really raw steak, you could end up with a parasite.
Yeah, pork. Raw pork is a typical one for tapeworm.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
I avoid cooking pork. I'm crap chef. So, if I undercook it, there could be a parasite in there, couldn't there?
Yeah. Usually you'll be able to see it though. So when the pork's cut, if you look at bacon or whatever, you'll actually see the circles of the cysts.
I've seen them once before. Next week I'm working on a farm for a little bit of time. And yes, there'll be a lot of worms involved there that we will see. Because they're just everywhere and they just invade everything. And we've got some bad news about them today, and I've got some good news to finish off with.
Okay, well, we'll start with I guess we'll first discuss all the bad news stuff first. But you made a good point, Steve. It's like where, you mentioned how many people have parasites. So where do we get these parasites from?
Where they start from is the soil, and they're just everywhere throughout the earth. And so you can pick them up through any sort of people eating dirt or kids, unhygienic practices. We'll leave it at that. And then they're spread by worse unhygienic practices.
Yes,
which can involve.
We'll just say that if you've ever been at a kindergarten, there's a lot of unhygienic practices that happen there. That's another way of spreading it. Scratching your bum, picking your nose, all of that kind of stuff.
And both at the same time.
And then touching other kids and all of that. And then pets. I find that pets is also a very big one, and farm animals, very big sources.
Yep.
And then tank water. Like a lot of people who grow up on farms, I've had people describe how they just, they'd be like, oh yeah, we used to drink the tank water and we'd see little things floating and swimming around in it. And I'd be just horrified. I'd be like, because that's kind of like where we get exposed to a lot of this stuff.
I can tell you a very unrelated story about tank water because I live in suburbia in the Gold Coast, and we have a tank because you sort of have to. And so the water that comes out of the tap for the garden tap is from the tank, and it's designed to, they call it grey water for doing things like that. Now, I was a genius one day and filled my water bottle in my car up with tank water. And guess what? Had a massive overgrowth of mold in it and had to get the pump replaced.
Oh.
So that's just my tank water on the Gold Coast, like suburbia. And so there's stuff growing everywhere. And so if I, did what I did when I was a kid, and we used to drink garden hose tap, because there wasn't no bottled water in 1847 when I grew up. And so we didn't have any of that sort of stuff. And so, worms are everywhere. Yeah. And here's a scary thing, and what we know about worms, and they cause all sorts of symptoms, and we'll get onto those. One thing they do cause in kids is allergies and asthma and atopy and allergic rhinitis, and anything else starts with A, by the way. And then the way they work is that when you've got parasites, say in your bowel, okay, you've got your colon there, and the parasite can be huge. Like compared to an immune system, you can't see a white blood cell, you can't see with the naked eye. Worms, you can see with the naked eye. Tapeworms, can be, I think, meters long. So they're huge. So that little tiny immune system has got nothing against a massive tapeworm. I'll use this as an example.
Yeah, because they do. Like they grow meters long. Yeah.
And so the only way the immune system gets rid of it, of course, is it creates a lot of mucus. And so it drives up an aspect of the immune system called the T helper 2 immune system. And in the immune system, we've got T helper 1, T helper 2, T helper 9, T helper 17, and T helper 33. We've got a few of them going on there, and they all have different roles in the immune system. And the T helper 2s get rid of these parasites. And so when T helper 2 goes up, because you're infested with these parasites, it creates all this mucus. And in your colon, of course, the idea is that the parasite that's latched on there will slip out with all the mucus. And that's how it technically works, but it activates the mucus throughout your entire body. So you end up with conditions like asthma, hay fever, allergic rhinitis, all these sorts of things that can be caused by worms.
Wow.
And I don't know how many kids go to see an immunologist and they go, oh, well, you got asthma or, something like that, then we're going to treat that with this corticosteroid and that puffer and salbutamol and all these sorts of drugs and all that sort of thing, and don't address worms. And a third of kids have worms.
Well, that makes, if you kind of like look at how we diagnose, things like parasites is a lot of practitioners use just a blood test, right? Because generally high levels of eosinophils, which can either be associated with allergies, that whole histamine IgE reaction, and it's also known to be associated with parasites.
Absolutely.
So there you go.
If I took Flatface to the vet, my cat, Flatface.
Your adorable
He's very good looking.
cat, yes.
And the way to test him for parasites is look at the eosinophils. Now, eosinophils are part of the T helper 2 immunity. Now, T helper 2 immune system, when it comes up, it drives out all sorts of chemicals like interleukin 13, interleukin 5 and interleukin 4, and that activates the B cells in the body, the B cells, to secrete, to turn into plasma cells that then secrete IgE antibodies. And these antibodies bind to mast cells, and the mast cells degranulate and release histamine, and you get all this mucus. And so that's fine in the bowel, but you also get in the nose and that sort of thing. And the eosinophilia is a resultant of that T helper 2 immunity. So, I mean, you could have asthma all your life or as a kid, and it could just be you've got a case of worms, you don't technically have asthma.
Yeah.
Or we've got these allergies and they go along and all this sort of stuff and they realise, well, it's just worms.
Yeah, so maybe, if you can think about, you make a good point about lifelong asthma, right? So if you had a dog when you were 4 years old and, dog was licking your face and all that kind of stuff, and you've always had asthma, well, because parasites, they'll just stick around and their life cycle just continues unless you figure out that's what's going on and you get, you treat yourself for it. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
You're gone. Yeah, you're absolutely gone. Now, I love some of the parasites. You've got to tell me, what do hookworms feed on?
Yes, so hookworms are a little bit like little vampires. Now, hookworms, if you look at most of these parasites close up, I mean, viruses look a certain way, and bacteria look a certain way, and mold look a certain way. Well, parasites literally look like little aliens. I mean, they've got like jaws and teeth and. It gets pretty disturbing when you look at them. So hookworms kind of like have these teeth, these scissor-like teeth, and they kind of like hook into your intestines, like your stomach wall, right? And they just hang on there. And what they do is they actually suck some of that blood in the submucosa, So they actually feed off human blood, and they're a common cause, especially if there's a lot of them, for anemia, for chronic anemia, because they like vampires. That's
they
what
literally
they do.
suck. And they suck. And I remember when I read a book, Bram Stoker's Dracula, a famous book in primary school, and we were told that vampires are allergic to sun, or not allergic to sun, that they get killed by the sun, they get incinerated, but also they hate garlic.
Yes, very. Actually, I'd never made that connection. That is so cool.
It's not a good connection to make, but garlic, of course, kills parasites. Yeah. So I just thought it's a good.
There you go.
See, primary school, I'd love it. Back in the 70s when I was at primary school. So very interesting. But what I love about parasites is there's so many of them. They're absolutely everywhere, and as we've said, it causes atopy and all those sorts of things. And one of the other things about parasites is now I've got here about reproduction. It talks about having an orgy in your colon. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, different parasites have different ways of, I guess, procreating, so to speak.
Polite way of putting it.
And, some of them are more complex, like Cryptosporidium has a very complex life cycle. But your helminthic parasites, they've got a very typical life cycle. You generally get male and female helminths, and then they engage in sexual reproduction as you do.
Yes.
But they can also turn into hermaphrodites if they need to.
Right.
So there's a lot of activity going on in the intestines when you have parasites.
Great. Now, I love activity in the colon, of course. I love talking about that. That's naturopaths are obsessed with that. Now, when it comes around every 28 days, we have a full moon. Okay, now every full moon I get really hairy and start to howl at the moon. But what happens? I don't. But what happens with parasites around a full moon?
Well, so typically around the full moon, give or take 4 days or so around it, is when the eggs hatch. Because they are, parasites, they lay eggs and cysts and stuff like that, most of them. And so that's around the time that they hatch. Now, a really interesting thing is that parasites release a byproduct called ammonia. It's a natural product that they kind of release. Ammonia has got lots of negative effects in the body, but ammonia is smelling salts. So some of the older, I guess, listeners know.
Or people my age, because I used to use smelling salts.
Yeah, like a lot of the young, the young crew may not know what smelling salts is, but it's, when the women fainted and they would have the smelling salts and she would wake up, and regain consciousness, so to speak, that's ammonia. And so you can imagine that as a proposed theory, when around full moon, you have potentially more of these parasites getting out of the, hatching and producing ammonia. And that's why we find in clinical practice, people with parasites, they often wake up at around 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning around full moon especially, but it can sometimes be on a more regular basis because that's kind of like when they're a little bit more active. But around the full moon, if you've ever... A typical symptom where you need to start thinking parasites is, especially with children, is when they become very, more tantrums, more aggressive, more moody, more challenging, more difficult to handle around the full moon. That's kind of like, the telltale sign you need to start investigating possible parasites.
God, I remember when I was a kid and I watched the American Werewolf in London. It scared me. Those movies that like I remember Jaws too. I wouldn't even have a bath after that.
Yeah.
In 77 when that came out, that was thanks Mum for taking me to those movies. Very scary. But a lot of things, around the full moon we have all sorts of gravitational pulls. I mean, not just necessarily with the light. There's certain things that people feel, like we know that the reef spawns during a weekend after the full moon or something. I can't remember. Someone will know that. So there's lots of things happening around the full moon. And what I find fascinating about the whole parasite thing is that they have these life cycles. They reproduce and they grow inside the colon and they feed off your blood. Now, they also change the microbiome, don't they?
I believe it encourages the growth of Klebsiella bacteria. So Klebsiella, we've spoken about Klebsiella before in terms of ankylosing spondylitis and things like that. It can change the gut microbiome by encouraging the growth of Klebsiella bacteria, which can then affect the biosynthesis of vitamin B12. And I found another parasite, tapeworm. Common tapeworm is another one that can cause B12 deficiencies as well. So a lot of these parasites, they can change our gut microbiome and then also change the nutrients that a lot of our gut bacteria produce. And they also become competitive. They start competing for our nutrients with us. And so a lot of micronutrient deficiencies can occur as a result of chronic parasite infestations.
It's a bit scary because you think of a condition like, say, simple anemia. Someone doesn't have enough red blood cells. You've got a big worm potentially sucking the blood directly, which can cause anemia. And then you've got these other things that stuff up B12, which is involved in making red blood cells. We won't bore you with the details there. So you can get frank anemia just from having parasites. And people are going, but I'm eating all the red meat in the world, probably a bit raw, which means they get more parasites. And they're going, and I'm just anemic. And it's like, and this could be one of the more common conditions, especially found in women, that could be due to parasites. Another one.
I think it's very underdiagnosed. A lot of some parasites are seen as kind of like, harmless by certain certain sections of the medical community. So things like Diagnose fragilis and Blastocystis hominis are seen by many practitioners as being fairly harmless. Now, it's true, like some people have these parasites and they don't have any symptoms, and others do have them and they do have symptoms. So whether there are other biochemical, genetic components that make certain people more vulnerable, probably true, because we know that a lot of people can have parasites and they kind of, everyone lives together in harmony.
It's quite amazing, isn't it? The one man's food is another man's poison. It's been famous, said a number of things. So it goes with infections as well. I mean, as I said, you talk about Klebsiella, and if you've got the right genes, and Klebsiella is, you look at all the tests, it's non-pathogenic. And I'd very much argue with that, and you end up with a crippling arthritis from the stupid bug. But that's just due to my genetic makeup. There happened to be this weird HLA-B27. So you're right. It just changes the way things can happen. Now, another thing that changes dramatically is that we know that a lot of worms reduce the levels of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, adrenaline in the brain. I mean, what clinical impact does that have?
Well, huge. I mean, dopamine. First of all, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. There are three catecholamines. You kind of like need dopamine to make norepinephrine, epinephrine. And we know, in previous podcasts we've talked about ADHD and dopamine. We know that dopamine is the neurotransmitter for focus and concentration, and also motivation. Motivation to go to the gym, motivation to do a lot of things. And we know that norepinephrine is involved in short-term memory, and we also know that both norepinephrine and epinephrine is part of the adrenal, hormonal cascade, energy production and all of that kind of stuff. So when we have organisms that start to create imbalances in the brain in these neurotransmitters, as well with serotonin, because we need serotonin to make melatonin, so that's another sleeping kind of a neurochemical. Yeah, it affects our mood, it affects our sleep, it affects our circadian rhythms, affects our energy levels. And that's typically the kind of like symptoms that we see with a lot of people clinically who have parasite, chronic parasite overgrowth. They do have all of these mood issues and things like that. And so again, if we go back to the allergy analogy, how many people who are put on antidepressants or on Ritalin, how many kids put on Ritalin, it's could be helped in other ways by identifying whether they've got parasites and getting those treated.
Extraordinary, because let's take that a step further. Let's take a case of Jane Smith, who heads off to the psychiatrist because they've been referred to by their GP because they've got a depression. There's no cause for their no obvious cause. They're happy life. They've got a husband, 2 kids, whatever, but they're just finding themselves not coping and completely overwhelmed with everything. They go to the psychiatrist. How many psychiatrists, a little bit of a rhetorical question, but how many psychiatrists look into parasites?
Oh, very few. And that's just because that's unfortunately how medicine has evolved. We've become specialists and we've stopped being generalists. I remember the old days, I used to go, when I went to the doctor, the GP, they were kind of like, pretty much over everything. But these days, it's like the GP just refers you to some kind of a specialist. And if you go to a gastroenterologist, all they're going to look at is your gut. If you go to an endocrinologist, all they're going to look at is your hormones. So medicine is not really designed to look at the overall picture anymore, which means that you are gonna miss things. So many. I'm gonna take a bet that most psychiatrists wouldn't have any idea of how much the gut influences neurological health. I'm sure there would be. There's a lot of them that would be getting on board with and looking at that kind of stuff. But in general, that's not part of their training. So yeah, probably not that many.
It's scary because over 90% of the serotonin's made in your gut. So if you've got worms infesting you and they reproduce, as we've talked about, they could have a massive overgrowth there, and your serotonin levels could be depleted dramatically. And that causes, as you said, lots of depression, anxiety, all sorts of mood disorders. And it's rarely investigated yet. As I said, a quarter of the population have worms.
Yeah.
A quarter, 2 billion people. Now, think of the farmers, okay? They're probably more exposed to worms, right? There's a lot of depression rampant throughout our farms. Now, it's, hypothetically, I haven't seen a study on this, but you take a group of farmers, you measure them for worms. Wow. I mean, how many would they have worms? It would be a lot of them. If a quarter of the population they have, possibly, I'm going to guess now, probably half our farmers do, because they're exposed to livestock and all that sort of thing. Here's another one for you. We've got we've got worms going on throughout our population, and we've got worms reproducing, we've got worms causing asthma, we've got causing neurological diseases. But with regards to worms and parasites in general, what do you think would be the best way to test for them? Because you were talking about, I'm thinking stool analysis. And I know you've got some information on that.
Yeah. So stool analysis is probably the best way. Yeah. Well, it's the only real way that you can kind of like check. And most of it is macroscopic, which means they will look under a microscope because you can see them. They're not like viruses and bacteria, which cannot be seen by the naked eye. And you need very strong microscopes to see them. You can generally see them. A lot of people can even see them, if it's really bad, once they have a bowel motion, a lot of people pick up on, but they can see things in their stool, in the toilet, right? And
drowning.
And often they move and all kinds of stuff.
Great.
So generally it's laboratory analysis. But what's very, very interesting is, the analysis and the transport and all of that becomes very important. So they find that especially with organisms that create diarrhea, so typically those would be things like trophozoites, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yeah, that's it, trophozoites, yep.
So typically organisms like that's responsible for diarrhea. Once they leave the body, they kind of you have to kind of check that within 30 minutes, which is impossible in terms of sending a stool sample, right? Now, when it's a formed stool sample, you've got about 24 hours. You have to check it within about 24 hours. Now, a way you can get past that is you can use a preservative, which is what a lot of the companies do. When they give you like a little sample container to take your sample, there would be some kind of a preservative in there.
Right.
So preservative will immediately immobilize the parasite and kind of preserve it so that you can kind of test for it. What was very interesting though is that because they're very inconsistent on their daily numbers with pretty much all parasites, they will vary from day to day to day to day. So they're very inconsistent in their numbers, and it's very easy to miss them if you only do one stool sample. So with one stool sample, the chances of you detecting it is less than 50%. Whereas if you do 3 stool samples, your chances increase by more than 95%.
Right.
So it's always recommended to spend that little bit extra money and do a 3-day specimen collection. Yeah. Now, generally, people are told to do it 3 days in a row. There are some studies that show it's better to do it on alternate days within a 10-day period. But this is, everyone will have slightly different opinions on that. But you can miss parasites on stool samples if you don't transport it correctly and collect it correctly. And not all parasites produce cysts and eggs, because sometimes, the cysts will kind of it'll hatch within a few days later, which is why the laboratory can then pick it up a little bit later with different specimens. Right. But there are certain ones like the trophozoites, for instance, they do not actually insist. So once they leave the body, they don't insist. And so they will disintegrate very quickly. And that's why you have to, with those ones, test the sample within 30 minutes. not of 30 minutes of arriving at the lab, within 30 minutes of
exiting the
body, which is very hard to do. So it's just it's one of the most notoriously hard organisms to test for accurately, which is why a lot of the labs also use PCR technology, which is looking for DNA fragments of these parasites, and they don't always just rely on a macroscopic, like looking for them in the stool sample.
Polymer chain RNA. Right, so that's PCR. So that's very interesting. Now, there's a few herbs that we've identified in the papers here. We just picked 3 that are known to have anti-parasitic effects. Now, the 3 herbs we talked about can be taken on a daily basis. They're not weird. They're not things. There's Artemisia, licorice, and turmeric.
That's right, yeah. So Artemisia nua, because there are different species of Artemisia. And then, licorice or Glycyrrhiza glabrias, it's known, and then turmeric. So those are very common herbs that are used as antiparasitics. Traditionally, pumpkin seeds was a big one, right? The roughage, and all of that. There's a really interesting one that's also used a lot as parasite cleansers. And I actually asked my farmer friend about it, and he was like, "Oh yeah, farmers have been using it for years. It's commonly known, and that's called it's a white powder called diatomaceous earth." Now, just keep in mind, there's food grade diatomaceous earth, and there's the non-food grade. So if you are going to take it, make sure it's the food grade diatomaceous earth.
Make note there, yeah, absolutely.
Yes. But it's a fairly tasteless powder. It tastes a bit like chalk, really. And when I asked my farmer friend about it, he said, they kind of like take it and they put it in the feed of the animals and pigs and stuff like to help them get rid of parasites.
Awesome. We used to use diatomaceous earth making soap many years ago when I was a chemist. And you add that to the tallow and it cleans up the tallow. It takes all the impurities out of it,
cool.
which is really interesting. And I used to speak a little bit of Greek, and one of the guys there was telling me that he takes it, like he takes some every now and again, and just the stuff out of a bag. Certainly not the food grade one. This is the stuff you tip into the
buy
tallow.
it at the, what do you call those? The produce.
We used to get on the back of a pallet of a truck. And this is a very rough guy. And because I don't speak Greek very well, I sort of said, do you take a spoonful? And what I actually asked him was, can I take a spoonful? So he gave me a spoonful of it. Just to try it. It tastes awful.
Yeah,
this was
dry.
the non-food grade. It's and I just thought, what an idiot, because bad language, of course, and I don't speak Greek much anymore. It's all Greek to me now. So, but those are the days. You just gave it a go. Now, we've talked about some bad things. I want to give you some good news about worms now.
Yeah, I think I need some good news because I'm very concerned about what could be going on in my digestive system at this point in time.
There's a few papers, and there's some in your pile, so it's really, really interesting, which shows that there is a new philosophy for giving certain types of worms to increase your lifespan.
Wow.
Yep. Released 2020.
Yeah.
And what they've found is that there's some people that have certain types of worms, Harmless, they actually live longer. And that they live longer because it reduces inflammaging. And we're going to give the references out there. So now inflammaging is not me slurring 2 words together. It's a term used for the chronic diseases that are associated with inflammation. Because remember, we talked about this thing boosting T helper 2. A lot of people have too much T helper 1, which is very inflammatory, and T helper 17, which is like ankylosing spondylitis. And they're very inflammatory. Now, T helper 2 works like a seesaw that knocks them down. So if you can reduce the inflammation associated with aging, like cardiovascular disease, heart disease and cancers and these sorts of things.
Blood sugar, metabolic disorders.
Yep, metabolic disorders, all these inflammaging, right, disease. So as you age, you lose your sex hormones, which are protective against inflammation, that they're now giving worms early trials to reduce, and it's certainly reducing the inflammation in people by driving up T helper 2, which drives down T helper 1.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. What a and the title is amazing. It says something like unholy or filthy thing. Yeah, it's got a great title. I think it's that paper there.
Oh, this one here.
Yeah. Okay, the title is A Gross Way to Live Long, Parasitic Worms as an Anti-Inflammaging Therapy. I love that. So Look, you don't believe me? There's the paper. So it's an amazing paper, and it says, and I'll quote it, helminth therapy could have anti-inflammaging effects. Could worm infections provide broad-spectrum protection against age-related diseases?
Wow.
That was the end of the title. So, they're talking about this is published in eLife 2021, actually. So this is very new information, and they're using it to reduce inflammation. And one thing we know also about worms, which is found out to be quite positive in a more recent event. So they looked at chronic infections in people that can kill people, right? So bad
like viral
viruses,
infections.
Viral infections, yeah, absolutely. And they found that some people were getting a particular viral infection and other people were getting a particular viral infection. And there were certain groups that weren't dying with this viral infection, and there were groups that were. So they looked at the people that obviously weren't dying and said, why are you so special? What's going on here? And what they found was that they were infested with worms. And so worms, as we've said in this paper, reduce inflammation.
Yeah.
So with a lot of viruses, you get this runaway inflammatory response in the body, and it causes lung involvement and all sorts of breathing disorders, and you end up croaking it. Well, the worms protect against that inflammatory response.
It goes a little bit back to that, the hygiene hypothesis. So we've always just thought it'd be about bacteria's involvement in the hygiene hypothesis, but now it's like a parasite kind of involvement there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so parasites have been in the human body probably since Australopithecus was 3.5 million years ago eating raw meat. Okay, before the advent of fire, before the hominids started to cook their meat, they would catch and kill the raw meat. Probably infested with parasites back then. I imagine they've been around a long, long time. So for millions of years, humans have been exposed to these parasites, and we have just built up like a tolerance, and even they have throw some beneficial effects for some people in certain circumstances. Now, the $1 million question is, in what circumstances, which bugs, which ones? We don't really know. This is 2021 information. But what I'm thinking, and I'm hypothesizing, is going forward, is we're going to find, like you're going to take probiotics, like we have in the 80s and 90s. We're going to be taking worms.
Well, anti-helminthic therapy is already a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Anti, but what about?
Sorry, not anti-helminthic therapy is already a thing.
So it's going to become a bigger thing, I think. So we're going to be killing bad worms, which we know cause asthmas and all these sorts of diseases that we've talked about, and stuffing up your brain. And parasites can grow in the brain too. You know that. You've seen MRIs of people with parasites.
Especially tapeworm.
Yeah. So that's obviously bad. We're not talking about giving them tapeworms in the brain.
No, although that was like, I remember that was, I think it was in the 80s. That was a popular dietary treatment, right?
It was.
It's shocking, because you do lose, I don't think I should even say it because I don't want people to go out and look for tapeworms.
I don't think I'll find that it will
it causes, of course, weight loss because the worm eats all your food. And so I remember that it was a craze with some probably more predominantly women were wanting to get infected with tapeworms so they could lose weight, which I just, it's a bit bizarre.
You're a runner. I go running and gymming. What's easier, having tapeworms or going for a run?
See, the whole tapeworm thing, I've heard some horror stories on the farms about tapeworms and excreting them, which I will not repeat on here because it's absolutely disgusting. Yeah, you kind of like pull them out, and you got to be careful because they break off, right?
Oh, yes, okay.
In segments.
And then
I think let's just leave it at that. Let's just leave it at that. But
sitting, adjusting his head. But isn't this cool? Like we talk about worms, how bad they are, and there's literature showing they're bad, and then we talk about living longer with these damn things, and it's sort of like it's sort of like a certain amount and overgrowth of this. It all comes back to this balance, because certainly inflammaging is rampant throughout. The cultures in Western society where we're very agricultural. We throw chlorine in the water to kill everything in there and all this sort of stuff to kill these parasites. And then we found out there may be a benefit to some of them. And it starts to you start to question this, as you said, the hygiene hypothesis, which was around in the early 90s of my memory, that these things may have some benefit. And they certainly can protect against certain viral infections. That's been published. So this is really interesting. And we know they cause asthma, but then It's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I have a feeling it's got to do with the synergy between, because we know, there's our organisms in our gut are beneficial to us because they're commensal.
Yes.
But when they overgrow, they can become pathogenic. So I think everything is about balance, probably the type of species as well. I'd say there's probably a lot of variables in why some people will find benefit with them and some people may not, so I think it's more complex than that. But it's good to kind of like see some of this research come out and looking at how these organisms can affect our behavior.
Yes.
And parasites specifically so. Unfortunately, I don't have the study here, but there has been quite a few associations made between disorders such as schizophrenia and parasites.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned there is a paper there on schizophrenia which talks about that it could be a leading cause of schizophrenia. And I think that's it there. If you read that highlighted bit there, that's published in as we talk about.
Oh, actually, you are correct. This one is called Associations of Mental Disorders and Neurotropic Parasitic Disease. And it says here, that supports the hypothesis that toxoplasmosis, which is a type of parasite, could be the cause of schizophrenia. And it kind of like,
Wow.
That's huge.
It's huge. I mean, that's published 2019. Again, how many psychiatrists address that?
Yeah. And I've always, all organisms have an influence on the brain, right? There's that big gut-brain connection.
Yep.
But I'd have to say, from clinical experience, parasites probably have the most profound in that it can really change the behavior of people. Like, a lot of people will describe it feels like I'm possessed by a body snatcher kind of thing.
Sort of
So a lot of the times they'll know that what they're thinking is not right, but it's just like they're not in control of what they think and their behavior. So
it's amazing.
It's very interesting what parasites can do. And I don't know if you've ever seen with Flat Face if he experiences it, but I know some people have said if their pets have parasites, they know because their pets' behavior change. They start doing all kinds of.
Well, Flat Face is well looked after. He gets cooked salmon, hand fed, so he doesn't have parasites, and he gets wormed. So we try and kill his parasites. But yeah, I know it certainly does affect their brains of animals. But thinking humans, I mean, this is huge. I mean, mental health. We've talked about living longer. We've talked about asthma and immune disorders, and a treatment for inflammation and living longer. There's a lot to this, isn't there?
Yeah.
We've got to do another one on this way down the track because we did bum grubs, and this one will have a much better title, much more politically correct, I think.
I think so. And I think before, we finish off, it's good for people, to know what the typical symptoms are of having parasites. So they, if they identify with any of those, maybe, go and see someone who can help investigate. But things like the full moon cycle, like getting worse around full moon, the waking up early in the morning, like 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning on a consistent basis. And then another very typical one is grinding of the teeth. So grinding of the teeth is a big one. Itchy bum, which is kind of what you would expect, I guess.
Yep.
But those are very typical kind of symptoms of parasite overgrowth, and also, I guess, unexplained nutritional deficiencies.
Yes, the anemias, etc. Well, I mean, that's a great place to leave on because we've addressed all that. And I think it's good to know that the people have got to be aware that they could have an overgrowth of this stuff, and check it out if you do.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've thoroughly covered this, and I think we're thoroughly out of time too.
We are.
All right, so we'll see you again all next week, and have a great week.
Bye, guys.